could Babe Ruth play today? My answer is yes, and I hope to convince you at least to move more in that direction after watching today's video. So the reason why this comes up for me is because Babe Ruth is the number one pound for pound hitter of all time if you go by the equation that I created, which is 1,000 divided by at-bats per home run, and that number divided by body weight. And I ranked all the hitters according to that equation, and Babe Ruth is number one. Now, many people will say that his swing couldn't cut it today. It's a swing that worked back then, but it wouldn't work today. I think that Babe Ruth exemplified great swing mechanics. And I think that in the past 40, 50, 60 years, we've gotten away from that kind of swing. We've actually denigrated it. We've said that the way he swings is exactly the way you don't want to swing. That's the way instruction has handled it. They call it pulling off the ball or dragging the barrel. Interestingly, he's got a lot of similarities in his swing to Ken Griffey Jr. They both laid the barrel pretty flat as their hands were being left behind, and they achieved very well-connected positions at contact. The common argument is that the talent pool is just so large now. Stephen Jay Guild, who was a paleontologist and an author of a book, I believe it was called Full House, in which he made the argument that because of the size of the talent pool now, hitters are obviously getting better.
If we study the full variation, we'll see that 400 hitting has disappeared in baseball because the variation has shrunk, not because hitting's gotten worse.
Okay, well,
Once again, I think these are just knee-jerk kind of responses to a situation that is much more complex. There's more to it than just a large talent pool or players are bigger and stronger. Of course, being bigger and stronger helps with hitting. We saw that in the steroid era. It clearly helps. But once again, hitting is not just a bigger, stronger contest. There are more skills in hitting than just how strong you are. And for my purposes, I've always been interested in the swing primarily. So when I argue that Ruth could play today and could dominate just as much as he did, I'm coming at it more from a swing mechanics perspective. I believe that his swing has been underestimated, and if dropped into this world that we are in today, would deliver almost more than it did back in his day, because no one else is swinging like he swung. So it's almost like he would have a mechanical advantage. We have a tendency to favor that which we know. And people don't know the hitters from Ruth's time. They don't know Babe Ruth, except for these sped up videos that look like he played in just this silly little game, this almost like a circus act, the way you look at his highlights. And so people just impetuously assume that he was playing an inferior game. David Epstein, the author of The Sports Gene, actually talked about this subject, where people just assume that guys like Jesse Owens was so much slower than guys today. And he proved in his book that that's not really the case. I'm not interested in being a contrarian. I'm not just saying that Babe Ruth would dominate today just because I want the attention. Or I've also been accused of being someone who misses the past. And that's not it either. I'm not a fan of Babe Ruth's. I'm simply a fan of what works. And I would just ask you, what about today's system in which we bring kids up in our baseball culture? What about it would be better than kids playing in the sandlots? Because to me, the sandlots are more in line with what experts in learning say is the best way for kids to learn. Kids learn very well just on their own, just experimenting having the freedom to play and experiment. Also, their equipment was crude. As Ido Portal, one of my role models in movement, says, the more expensive the equipment, the cheaper the user. And that certainly applies. Yes, we have more expensive equipment now, but there's an inverse relationship between the cost of the equipment and the skill level of the user. They said about St. Mary's, the orphanage that Babe Ruth grew up in, that it was almost like a baseball camp with all the baseball that they played there. There was an absence of swing instruction, and I believe that swing instruction, for the most part, has done more damage than anything. Number two, they weren't swinging plastic. They weren't playing wiffle ball. They were swinging wood, sometimes heavy wood. They were throwing baseballs as opposed to throwing wiffle balls or getting pitches out of a pitching machine, which doesn't improve your pitch recognition skills. You have to actually see the release of the pitcher. And the plastic bats shape your swing. And the wooden bats shape your swing a certain way. They both lead to disparate movements. And I think pitching machines really have been an insidious invention. They're still being used by coaches at the highest level, and I think that's a really big mistake. The more you see the release of the pitcher, the better. So these guys growing up in the sandlots, they saw actual releases of pitches. So one of the viewers of my channel had the idea of gathering how Ruth did against Hall of Fame pitchers. This would give us a good indication of how he would have done today, in the eyes of people who say pitching was better, which I'm not convinced. But just to satisfy them, find out how he did against Hall of Fame pitching. So against Lefty Grove, who was a Hall of Famer, he had 135 at-bats, hit 9 home runs, and batted .311. Against Walter Johnson, probably the best pitcher of his time, one of the best pitchers of all time, said to have tremendous speed. He hit 7 homers and 102 at-bats and hit .373. Against Red Faber, 168 at-bats, 8 homers, .274 average. And against Carl Hubble, and Red Faber, by the way, is a Hall of Famer. Carl Hubble, another Hall of Famer, lefty. He only had 3 at-bats, but he went 2 for 3 with a home run. Ruth's at-bat to home run ratio for his career was 11.76, which is third all-time. His at-bat to home run ratio against Hall of Famers was 13.44, which still would put him 6th all-time. And still, by the way, would put him number 1 among anyone below 230 pounds. Ruth weighed 215. His batting average for his career was .342. And against Hall of Famers was .339. So we're talking just a 3-point difference. And by the way, his batting average against Hall of Famers at .339 would still put him ahead of Tony Gwynn, who many people out there praise as being the ultimate hitter. Let's talk about the argument that pitching is faster today, because that's actually a misconception. What's actually happened is people are looking at the speed of pitching back in the 80s and seeing that it's roughly 8 miles an hour slower. And so they extrapolate that, well, if it was slower, that much slower in the 80s, there's probably, maybe double that by the time you get to the early 1900s. That's not good reasoning, because the fact is that it's not pitching speed that has gone up. It's the instruments used to measure pitching speed. which has measured the speeds as faster. Let me read an excerpt from a Baseball America article on this topic. So when you read of 85-mile-an-hour fastballs from the early 1980s, realize that they would be registering much faster with current measurement tech. An 85-mile-an-hour fastball, if registered by a speed gun at the plate, would be roughly 93 miles per hour if measured by StatCast out of the pitcher's hand. And that makes 100-mile-an-hour pitches by Nolan Ryan, thrown in 1974, as measured by Rockwell laser radar instruments relatively close to the plate, even more remarkable today. So if you add 8 miles an hour to Nolan Ryan's pitch, you have 108 miles an hour. That would be the record. So if pitchers weren't any slower back in the 70s and 80s, they probably weren't any slower back in the early 1900s either. And by the way, I can think of a lot of reasons why hitting was harder back in Ruth's day. They didn't wear helmets. Nowadays, guys are padded up from head to toe. Guy died in 1920, Ray Chapman. Exactly the era in question. Also, spitballs were largely accepted back in those days. And balls and bats were just heavier. The main angle from which I come at this is about swing mechanics. It's more of a tangential argument that I'm even arguing that Babe Ruth could still dominate today. But it's relevant to swing mechanics. I think that he exemplifies really great mechanics. Exactly the same way that Ken Griffey Jr. exemplifies great mechanics. And what they do goes pretty much 180 degrees against what is being taught. One of the key things that develops someone like Griffey and someone like Ruth, I believe, is the heavy bats that they used at a young age. It makes you have to use more of your body to swing the bat, to be more lead arm dominant, as I call it. And it's not just the bats. It's overall the more crude equipment made these guys who grew up in the sandlots back in the early 1900s. Sure, they may not have been as strong as the guys today. But in every other respect, I think that their skills were a little higher on average than today. I think that we need to stop underestimating these guys back in the early 20th century. I think they showed us a much better way to relate to the game. If we could combine the strength and size of today's player with many of the practices utilized by these guys growing up in the sandlots, I think we will start to see a new level of hitter. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.